All right, let's be turning our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 10 this morning. Hebrews, the 10th chapter. Just before class, I did put out a news sheet for next installment of study, which will be Hebrews chapter 11. And we'll make it there for sure next week. How far we get into today's lesson, I'm not exactly sure, but you'll have notes for chapter 11. And if you're reading ahead or you're familiar with Hebrews, you know chapter 11 it's a different chapter. You have numerous examples of faithfulness from the Old Testament on purpose. The writer's proving something by those examples. So we'll be doing a lot of historical overview in chapter 11. But if you want to turn your Bible to chapter 10 right now, we're going to pick up where we left off at. And then we have some good discussion in verses 19 through 25, probably is where we'll spend the bulk of our time this morning because of a very practical effect that he argues is a result of all the things that he's been talking about to this point. All right, so he's been making a point, the writer has been making a point about the superiority of Jesus over everything else. Over Melchizedekian priesthood, over the Old Testament Levitical priesthood, and because of that, the covenant that he administrates is a better covenant. And we really saw that in chapter 9. We are seeing it again in chapter 10. There he's arguing the superiority of the new covenant, that it's a better covenant, and that everything prior to that was types and shadows. It foreshadowed the real that was coming, and now we live under the real. That's his argument. So far, we had some great discussion last week on verses 1 through verse 4 of chapter 10 about the issue of forgiveness and remission and how all that works with the blood of Jesus Christ. And that really connects it to his previous statement back in chapter 9, verse 22, where he said that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. So there has to always be the shedding of blood. It's just that only one thing could ever offer satisfactory fulfillment of the scheme of redemption, and that's the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's what we've covered up to this point. Okay, so let's pick back up in verse 5, and I'm going to read the question on the notes. There's chapter 10 notes on the back table as well, if you need some of those for today. So the question is this: in verses 5 through verse 18 of Hebrews chapter 10, what is the writer's main point? And he does offer many points here about the sacrifice of Jesus. And we were sort of going through and looking verse by verse at this. And we didn't make it far into this question because all we basically did last week was note that what he does initially is quote from the Psalms. Now, if you'll start in verse 5, it says, "Therefore, when he came into the world, he said," and here's his quote of the Old Testament, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. Burnt offerings and in sacrifices for sins you have had no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God." What do you think is why is he doing that? Why is he quoting that? And what exactly does that psalm mean? I think it's been abused. I think it's been an abused psalm. Is he saying here when he says, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire," is this, as some say, God saying through the psalmist, I really don't care what you offer in worship. That doesn't really matter to me. Is that what he's saying? It can't be it. What is he saying here? Okay. Okay. Tommy, you had your hand up? Till the time of the Christ. Yeah. What is the perspective of this psalm? I know that David is the author of it from the human perspective. He wrote it, but is this David conversing with God, or is it David reflecting on another conversation? It's a different person who's doing the speaking. So even though David wrote it by inspiration, it is a recording of a conversation between the Son and the Father. So the Son, Jesus, is doing the speaking here. "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me." Whose body is that? It's the Lord's body, right? So he was brought into this world. He was virgin conception, and he was brought into this world. And I think we noted last week that anytime you talk about the birth of Jesus, it was with specific purpose. He was given a body specifically for the purpose of what? Of dying someday. He was being prepared as a sacrifice. Again, in verse 6, in burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, you had no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. This is the Lord speaking. In the volume of the book it is written to do your will, O God. So he came to accomplish what God wanted in the scheme of redemption. So this is a psalm written from the perspective of Jesus talking to his Father, in that he had a prepared body, and that the burnt offerings and sacrifices under the Old Testament were insufficient, like we talked about in verses 1 through 4, and that he came to do God's will. In other words, he would make a satisfying atoning sacrifice. Now notice in verse 8, he picks back up and says, previously saying, right, again noting the Old Testament, sacrifice and offering, burnt offerings and offerings for sin you did not desire. That does not mean that he didn't require those things in the Old Testament, because he did require those. But it's talking about redemption here, nor had pleasure in them which are offered according to the law. And then in verse 9, then he said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first that he may establish the second. So he quotes it again, and sometimes in the Bible he will do that. It's not redundancy. It's not just, just sort of beating the drum until, sort of just vanishes into nothing, right? This is, it has meaning. He quotes it, and then he quotes it again in the sense of showing the fulfillment of that through Jesus, by way of emphasis, to make the point clear that Jesus was talking to the Father, and this is about Jesus. So Jesus, when he spoke those, knew that he would intervene and satisfy redemption. That's his point in quoting it again. And then, for the readers who are struggling with whether they stay into the New Testament or try to go back under Old Testament law, it should be clear. If Jesus fulfilled what he said in prophecy back then in verse 9, what's the effect of that? If he accomplished redemption, what did he take away and what did he bring in? He took away the old. There is nothing left in the old, so that he brought in the new. And he's going to make a very practical demonstration of that in a minute. Like in verse 26, he says, if you willfully go back under the old law, there's nothing left. There's nothing under it for you under redemptive terms under the old law. So by doing this, he took away the old, and thus he established the new, which results in this, verse 10, by the which will we've been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ for once for all. Now this is talking to the readers. In what covenant had they been sanctified? By the new covenant, by the Lord's blood under the new covenant. So they were sanctified and able to approach God based on the conditions of the new covenant, right? So that it should have been easy for them to understand where redemption was and how they could not go back under a former covenant. Now, in verses 11 through 18, he's got some additional statements about the once-for-all nature of the Lord's sacrifice. In verse 11, he said, every priest stands ministering daily, often repeating the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. Now, this sort of has a current sort of season to it. When he's talking about these priests, as he's writing, they could think about what was taking place in the city of Jerusalem. They were still offering those daily in the city of Jerusalem, but those animal sacrifices, no matter how repetitious, could not satisfy the demands of the scheme of redemption. However, Jesus did satisfy it once for all, verse 12. This man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. So he sacrificed and made that once for all sacrifice. And don't miss this language. In verse 12, it says, he then sat down. Now, the priests who minister, what are they doing? They're standing up, because they've always got to be continually doing that. So if the Bible is able to say he offered and then he sat down, what's that tell you about his sacrifice? It was finished. It would never have to be repeated, never again. So then in verse 13, it talks about how he fills now a different role since his redemptive work is accomplished in verse 13. From that time, waiting until his enemies are made his footstool. Obviously, his role has changed because of the once-for-all nature of his sacrifice. And in verse 14, because he's completed redemption, he can now serve as our high priest and King. He is able to perfect forever those who are being sanctified. Now, you've got a couple of more quotes, and we've seen these already, so these are not newfound, right? It's not like we're just now being introduced to these, because in verses 15 through verse 18, he's quoting from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, which we saw back in chapter 8 about the new covenant. He says, "But the Holy Spirit also witnesses to us after he said before, this is the covenant I'll make with them. After those days, says the Lord, I'll put my laws in their hearts. I'll write it in their, and in their minds I will write them." Then he adds, "Their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is remission of sins, or remission of these, there's no longer an offering for sin." So he's talking about one of the benefits of the new covenant. What came with the new covenant? And the answer is the all-sufficient sacrifice for sins, to the point that, according to verse 18, there's no more sin offerings being made, as like in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22. So his point through all of that is the all-sufficiency of the Lord's sacrifice, that he died once on the cross, and that was sufficient to bring redemption for every transgression that ever has been or ever will be. Okay? Now, this is the part I want to slow down on, because I think we don't want to miss what happens in verses 19 through verse 25. I think it's a very powerful section. It's sort of, in the book, it is a transition into a very practical part of the book. He starts making very practical points, and this is the first of many practical points that he's going to make in the book. So here's question number 3, and I want to spend some time this morning talking about the answer to this. Number 3, in the light of the Lord's redemptive work. Now that's everything that he's been discussing, right? He's talked about it really since chapter 4, but chapter 5 he talked about how he's qualified to be a high priest. In chapter 6 he's entered into the veil to pave a way for us. In chapter 7 he's even better than Melchizedek, who is better than Aaron and the Levites. In chapter 8 he brought in and ushered in a new covenant. In chapter 9 everything in the Old Testament was a type and a shadow of the real, and he's the real, and his sanctuary in heaven is where we're based, and that's it. And then in chapter 10, bringing it all together. So in light of all of that, what should be the practical result? This is about the effect of all this in real life in verses 19 through 25. Then in verses 24 and 25, what is the example he provides of this practical effect? How does this look like what does this look like in real life? And what do you think is the struggle for many people with what he talks about? Why do so many people struggle with this? And then how can we explain the importance of assembling the saints? How do we do that? And it doesn't have to be just based on this passage. What does the Bible tell us about that? How important is it to assemble with the saints, and how vital is it to Christian living? So let's move from the more generic to the more specific. In this passage, in light of all that's been said about the Lord's redemptive work, what is the practical result of that he talks about in verses 19 through verse 25? What did you get out of this? Let's read those verses. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he consecrated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. Now, in general, what's his point? What's he trying to encourage the readers to do based on everything that Jesus has done for us? That's it. Yeah, what is it? Yeah, and Joe, you said the same thing. Just be faithful. Are these Christians struggling? Yeah, and so many times in the book, he's talked about how, while he doesn't consider them apostate, they're heading that way. Right, in chapter 2, he said, you're drifting away from the Lord. You're moving away from Jesus Christ. And so he lays out this case of everything that God has done in history and what Jesus accomplished at Calvary and how it's better than anything that's ever been. And he brought in, because of that, this brand new, better covenant that everybody's a part of. And now he says, as a result of all of that, be faithful. Be faithful. Don't turn your back on God, and that's the plea here. Draw near with the assurance that you can do that. Hold fast. You see that language in there. You see it over and over again. And so from this point, really until the end of the book, he just continually encourages them, don't give up. Be faithful. Be faithful. Keep on holding fast. All right, so let's look verse by verse at a couple of really unique words here. I love this word in verse 19. First of all, he says, therefore. What's that tell us? All right, this is a conclusion based on all that he's been saying to this point. And he says, brethren, having boldness. What's boldness? Where does confidence come from? Yeah, Art?
I can go straight to our Heavenly Father.
We can.
And the boldness that comes from that, the security that comes from that, that's enormous.
Yes. There is boldness or confidence. The word itself literally means freedom in speaking. And you and I, because of the work of Jesus, who do we have the opportunity to freely speak with? God. In ages past, that was not allowed except for certain people.
You can recall this in the old, under the old law, where God said, stay away.
Yeah.
If you come close, it's going to be death.
Yeah.
So there was a rule there, where particularly the period around the tabernacle, that there was caution. Attack. Now then, we go right there.
Yeah, that's right, because we talked about it last week a little bit. Leviticus 16, we sort of did a breakdown of the Day of Atonement. Who only was allowed inside the holiest of holies? The high priest, it was it. And the general worshiper in the Old Testament was kept away from the presence of God. But in the New Testament, under this new covenant, how many of us get to approach confidently before God's throne? All of us do. We all get to do that. You had your hand up, Tommy.
There's so many people that don't understand this, and as he mentions here, I don't want to jump ahead too much, when he talks about our bodies being washed.
Yes.
He's talking about baptism.
Yes.
The high priest had to cleanse himself
Yeah.
and do all the
Yep.
requirements in order to be able to present himself before God.
Right.
And so he's saying baptism here is the same way.
Right.
You have to be cleansed of your sins before you can approach God.
That's right.
And the way that we continually do that is like John says, the blood of Christ continually cleanses
Walking in
us
the light.
daily. So therefore we can continually have confidence
That's right.
to be in God's presence.
Yeah, that's right. That's the benefit of faithfulness as we get to do that, Bobby.
Just to kind of tie into what Tommy's saying, this is also where you look at the aspect that God doesn't hear the sinner's prayer.
Right. Yeah, it's a spiritual blessing. Prayer is a spiritual blessing. It belongs to those inside of Christ, so it's certainly unique. Ken?
What he addresses in chapter 11, yeah, you've got to go through that process, but I think what his point is, it's more an everyday thing, and an everyday thing, man can go to God. I think even in the because that's what those people did. David did that out in the wilderness, tending his flocks.
Yeah, and that's part.
He knew God was going to help him, and he had to have that relationship.
Yeah, and that's part of the greatness of the new covenant, is that it's not limited to certain specific days, right? In fact, he'll say in verse 20, it's a new and living way. Everything's changed with regard to that. It doesn't mean that there aren't regulations, but it means that the benefits we have are totally contrasting to what they had in the Old Testament. So I would agree that, he is in some way talking about limitations and versus no limitations under the new covenant. Yeah, so he pulls us right back into verse 20 and says, all of that changed because of the work of Jesus. It's a new and living way which he consecrated for us through the veil, that is his flesh. And then in verse 21, he talks about how we have a high priest that is over the house, which makes it better, right? A high priest over the house, not just simply in it, but over the house, the builder of that. And then in verse 22, because of that, we all get to draw near to God. The text would say something like, literally, keep on keeping on approaching. So as Ken was saying, it's not limited to a certain day. It's daily life. We get to do this all the time. We get to approach the throne of God. Yeah, and we don't want to give the impression, and I think you're raising a good point. Don't want to give the impression that with boldness it's sort of that there's some haughtiness about that, because we are before the throne of God, right? We're humbled before the throne of God, but we have confidence because the confidence is, I know I can do this because of what Jesus did, and I think that's what you're pointing out, and I think that's a great point. There are some word pictures in verse 22, right? He tells us, don't stop drawing near. You keep on drawing near with a true heart and full assurance. And he gives us two word pictures. Both of these are based on Old Testament word pictures that tell us something about the new. First of all, he said, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience. And then, number two, the bodies washed with pure water. And both of these draw from what they could understand, being Old Testament examples. First of all, he talks about hearts being sprinkled from an evil conscience. Was there sprinkling of blood in the Old Testament? Yeah. So the covenant was ratified in the Old Testament. Exodus 24, Moses gets up and he sprinkles the blood on the altar in the book of the covenant and ratifies that covenant with the blood of animals. Now, he's not saying that's how we're consecrated today, but it's a word picture. So he said our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience. In other words, they've been purified. We have a true heart when we go before God. And then, like Tommy was saying in verse 22, he talks about bodies washed with pure water. Now, in the Old Testament, there was a washing. We talked about some of that in the Day of Atonement. We outlined that last week, Leviticus chapter 16. Today, it's baptism. We're baptized into Christ for the remission of sins. And even in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 26, he talks about being washed with water with a word. So the language is very similar to that. The result of that is this, verse 24. Let us consider one another, or verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. There is no reason to turn our back on God, and every reason to hold on to him because he's faithful. And that's the point he's been making in all these many verses, is that God did what he said he was going to do. God is faithful to us. So instead of giving up, he challenges them to ways in which they would practically demonstrate their confidence in God, and one of those is the matter of assembling. He said, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. So instead of giving up, they need to dig in, they need to make a stand, they need to incite or provoke one another to love. That is love for God and love for each other, and to good works, right living. That's what Ken was talking about, right living and good example, that daily lifestyle. Yes, brother.
I think it goes to the point that, and if we understand this correctly, then we should have confidence in our eternal salvation, where we're going to go when we leave this world. As long as we're living the Christian life, walking in the light, Christ's blood is continually cleansing us, and God has promised us the eternal salvation if we're obedient. So I look at this as a confidence for us to know that when we pass from this world, we're living God as God has said. We know what we're going to be.
Yeah, there's confidence. And let's put it all together. Not only is there hope and expectation, but there's also a word picture that's being built for us about what takes place in the assemblies. And I didn't really put this in my notes, but just thinking through it, if he talks about going boldly before the throne of grace, where's one of those places that happens? In the assembly of the church. Because what is worship? In a word picture, what are we doing? We're bowing down before the throne of God. And we're doing that all together collectively. And so if they're going to hold fast and they're going to be faithful, then this is where they would want to be, because that's part of where that confidence is expressed, is in the assembly. So I want to talk about that for a few minutes, and I want to get to that latter half of the questioning where we talk about the assemblies, and why is it that some people have such trouble with that? Why is it such a problem with some people? Why aren't some people confident enough in the assemblies? I want to talk about all those things. So let's go to verse 25 with the understanding that what happens in verse 25 is all part of the leading idea in verse 24, that we're going to provoke one another or incite one another to love and good works, and this is one of the ways that happens, is the assembly. So first of all, what do you get from verse 25 when he says, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together as the manner of some men? What's the first thing that just pops off the page? Is this a problem that some in that day are having? Yes, they're having that problem. Yeah, that's it. It's very apparent that they were struggling with Old Testament, New Testament, and this was a huge issue for them as to whether or not they were going to be settled on the Old Testament or the New Testament, and it was having a very practical effect because the more they leaned toward the Old Testament, what was happening with assemblies? They were just forsaking the assemblies. They weren't at the assemblies where they should have been and needed to be. And so they weren't considering one another to provoke and to love good works by their absence. Now, the word assembling here means a collection in one place, specifically a Christian meeting for worship. So I don't think there's any question that this is an actual worship assembly that's under consideration. And I think the way that this is, the language provides, don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together. It would be any assembly that's been set up, that's been called from the local church. Now, I want to pause here before we get to some talk about this. Is it possible to not be in an assembly for a legitimate reason? Absolutely. And I don't, sometimes people struggle with that, and it is if there's legitimate. There are extenuating circumstances that do keep people out. What could some of those be? What is it? Okay, so sometimes people are sick, and you can't be in the assemblies of the saints. If you have the flu and you are highly contagious with the flu, your brothers and sisters who are also assembling that day would appreciate you not coming with the flu that day. You'll be greatly missed, but sometimes people are sick, and it's not just a virus. Sometimes they have diseases. Sometimes they're incapacitated. So that's understandable. That's built into the mercy of the Lord when it comes to that. Judy? Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Homes were Hebrews is 60s. 30 years into Christianity at that point. Yeah, so a lot of people met in homes, and like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, when he talks about the elect lady and Gaius, it appears that a lot of churches met in homes back then. So I think that whoever had a meeting place, and then it didn't have to be in a building. It could have been under a tree outside somewhere. But I think that the indication is they had regular places designated.
Well, according to Acts 20, verse 7, I think it's verse 7.
It is.
It showed that they met in a building.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people say that they didn't have places to worship, so they had to meet in homes.
Well,
There were buildings all around.
Well, apparently, even in Acts 2, they were renting courtyard space of the temple. They were meeting somewhere in that. So there were places to meet. I think we're confident in that. So,
Two or three are gathered together.
yeah, if the building burned down and we had chairs sitting in the parking lot, that would still be an assembly of the saints. You don't have to have a building, but it's just convenient. Tom, or somebody had their hand up back there. Tom.
In verse 25, the word manner,
Yes.
I wonder if it could be rendered today as habit.
It is something like that. The custom, the habit of some. I think that's the meaning of the word there. Yeah, so there was apparently a habit of some back then of not doing that.
They already saw
Mm-hmm.
continual
Yeah.
progress in those going away.
Yeah. Assembling is a habitual thing. It's part of the lifestyle like Ken was talking about. It's part of that daily living like Ken was mentioning. But there are times when people can't assemble. For example, when the elders of a congregation set a time, they say, we believe we will assemble at 9:30 for class, or we'll assemble at 10:30 for a worship service. Are they basing that time on when everybody can come? Is it possible that that time doesn't work for some people? So if you worked a job that you started at, you went into work at 12 midnight and you worked until 12 the next day, is that time going to be convenient for you? It's not going to work. So they're aiming at what is best for the majority of people, and sometimes it doesn't hit that. And sometimes, I heard work earlier, are there jobs that sometimes extend into Sundays? Yeah. If you are a medical professional, do you just leave your patients alone in the hospital on Sundays because you come to worship? And you say, I hope you're here Monday when I show back up. You don't do that, right? Somebody has to take care of them. There are jobs. Do police officers still work on Sundays? Yeah, there are jobs that require people to work on Sundays sometimes. Now, ideally, you would hopefully be able to make a service somewhere, and you could work your shifts around and maybe work it out with your boss, because it would be one thing to have an every now and then thing, and to not be at service for 10 or 15 years in a row. That's one thing, because the point is, we understand that there are extenuating circumstances that keep people away beyond their control. But it's a matter of choice. And you see that here in verse 25. They chose not to be there because, like Tom was saying, it was their habit, their custom not to assemble with the saints. All right? So real quick, before we get into some practical talk on this, he talks about they need to keep on doing it, and they need to keep on doing it as they see the day approaching, right? They need to continually provoke one another to love and good works. And as they see the day approaching, what do you think is that day that's approaching there, do you think?
I believe it's the destruction of Jerusalem.
I would agree. Can any of us see, ocularly, can we see events unfolding that would tell us about the end of the world? No, we're told nobody knows when the end of the world is going to be. And likely here, given the dating of the book, he's probably talking about destruction of Jerusalem, because there were a lot of things happening in the world, and they were about to be displaced, and they would need greater faithfulness going into that. So he likely is talking about that versus into the world. So I want to talk about this now. Just move away from it, just from a generic standpoint, drawing from wherever you want to draw from. I want to talk about secondarily why so many people struggle with this. Why is assembling with the saints so important to us? Is it important, and if it is, why is it so important? Jimmy, you had your...
Well, one thing in human history, all throughout the Bible, humans are forgetful.
Yeah,
And we have to be reminded daily, weekly,
yeah, I think so.
That God is God, and, prayer can pray continuously.
Yeah,
Just on Sunday.
that's a great point. In the book of Hebrews, just connecting the dots here to Jimmy's point, in the book of Hebrews, leading right up to this argument, he's talked about the sacrifice of Jesus and how that ought to make a difference in the way we live, in the way we think, in the way we act. Everything about us is different because of what the Lord did. Worship is about that. Is there a specific reminder of that every week? In the Lord's Supper. So one of the great benefits of worship, the reason why it's so important, is that there's that very formal, very commemorative act of remembering the sacrifice of Jesus. So it's very important because of that. I think so. Anything else? That's it. So look at verse 24. Considering one another in order to stir up love and good works, and then some were obviously not doing that by forsaking the assembling of the saints. So there's something about corporate worship, there's something about coming together as the church that's not just simply encouraging to me, it's encouraging to you and from you to me. So there's this sort of reciprocal encouraging benefit that comes out of a worship service that none of us get if we are forsaking the assembling of the saints. Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's right. And there's, the churches are not just one man or not just a handful of people. It's all of us, and there's a lot to be learned from all of us. And like Barry was saying, many of us, our faith has been greatly aided and strengthened, not just by a preacher or by a group of elders, but by the people that we make connections with within a congregation, and we gain from that every time we're together. I see a lot of hands. I'm going to try to get in order. I think Grady, and then Art, and then Tommy, and somebody back here had their hand up. So, Grady?
That there aren't
Yep.
a congregation.
Yeah, that's true.
We have
You remember in Acts 16, Paul and Silas were in prison, and they were the only Christians in prison, and they worshiped God in prison, just the two of them. So sometimes people are put in the position to do that. It shouldn't limit our ability to do that. I would say that's sad. It's sad that we haven't permeated the world with the gospel enough that we have congregations in every place, but that's sad. Art, you had your hand up?
It occurred to me, I don't get to see all of these folks every day.
That's right.
I look forward to seeing and greeting folks here at worship, you know, and when we come together for Wednesday, when we come together on Sunday night, I look forward to that because I can see most of these people during the week. And these are friends I can count on.
That's right.
And out in the world, I can't count on all those other people I see all week long.
That's right. Yeah, we need each other. And hang on, Tommy, and then Bobby.
Well, we don't have to think far back to realize during COVID, how did we feel
Yeah.
being separated? It was
It's
not a
terrible.
feeling. You know, we
Yeah.
long to be together because
Yeah.
we get something out of that.
Yep. Bobby? And then,
I would say especially in that time and probably a good bit, definitely a good bit now, the attitude of the people around them that were non-Christians was so moralized
Yes.
to them. They were outcasts.
yeah,
And we're seeing that in the world today. You're getting pushed as far away from religion in this country as possible. You come
Yeah.
together with your brothers and sisters, you've got the right mind.
that's right. Don, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think one of the things for me personally is that human nature is that you start taking on the characteristics of the groups that you're affiliated with. And the more we meet together as a group of
That's
Christians,
right.
the more we're going to take on and retain Christian characteristics. The more time we spend with groups that are non-Christian, there's a danger of us starting
That's
to
right.
take on
Yeah.
their characteristics.
That's right. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts especially, when the church is established in Acts chapter 2, from that moment, if you start reading the book of Acts, and almost every single chapter after that, there's an emphasis on togetherness. They were together. They were together. And for a lot of the reasons you talked about, Bobby and Don, for, you know, they became like each other, and they were escaping the world and doing that. There's something unique that happens in the assemblies that it's good for us. God designed it that way to be good for us, and we spiritually are deficient when we're not here like we need to be. Now, again, there are times when people just cannot be here for whatever extenuating circumstance they can. But if it's a choice, and my choice is I'm not going to the assemblies, then there's something spiritually that's happening, like in Hebrews, where I'm taking steps backward away from the Lord versus somebody who chooses to be there. There's just a lot we're missing out on. Besides the fact we're told, don't forsake the assembly of the saints. He's told not to do that. But we have to understand there's very practical benefit in doing that. We receive needed encouragement. This is where God meets with his people. We're missing out on a lot when we're not here. Not just the lessons, but like Barry talked about, there's fellowship. We grow as a church family. And besides, many acts of worship cannot be accomplished in any kind of setting except in a corporate setting, right? So there are some that are clearly corporate acts of worship that we have to be involved in, but we miss out on a lot when we're not here. So why is it such a struggle? I feel like it's every congregation struggle to try to. It feels like you're just dragging people. Come on, come be with us. Why is that such a hard thing for people to do? And maybe we've been there, right? I've been in the position before where I wasn't faithful in service. Right. One service. Yep. Sure.
And I don't know when the tradition started of having two services. I know mine started.
Right. That's exactly right.
Kind of by world sports is somebody that was a fireman, a police officer, whatever your profession is, that you can't be there sometimes. I know world sports is what you might have on third service.
Right. Right.
I just don't get that, and I never get the desire for the Sunday evening worship.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're not around the brethren and the good stuff there, why will the bad stuff in the world?
Yeah, and in truth, we spend so little time together anyway, right? We have an hour on Wednesday, an hour on Sunday night, 2 hours on Sunday morning, 4 hours a week. And for most people, that's all they get of the church. And then you fill the remaining 100 and whatever hours there are in the week with the world and interaction with the world. I would think that if we balanced it out, we would want more time with the church. And not just simply worshiping, but just being together. And we spend so very little time together. I don't know. I don't know why people struggle. Any other thoughts on this? Why is it such a struggle? Some of it has to be priorities. I know it's a lot about priorities. When you have poor priorities, and I don't know, maybe some are untaught. I jotted down in my notes that maybe some people are untaught. They just need to know better. Good habits are hard to establish, are they not? It's hard to break bad habits. Gloria, and then Don.
be at worship on Sunday, and I know that's probably not what was intended here,
Right.
but
Still,
that's,
certainly a good
that is
point.
a good approach. I think we need to be encouraging each other to be here, so we can see,
Yep.
we can be together.
That's exactly right, Don.
I think some of it, at least, I'll bring it back to me. Nowadays, the city environment, the church being in a city environment is a detriment to, a lot of times, wanting to meet. 21 years I lived down in Tampa, a very conservative Christian group, straight by the Bible and stuff. But I found myself the last several years looking for excuses
Right.
not to go on Sunday night, not to go on Wednesday night. So I felt it was really better for me. I needed to find a small town that had congregation in that town, so that not only the few times a week that I could meet with the Christians at the church building, but I would get to see people throughout the town. Like I run into Barry down at Lowe's, I think it was yesterday, the day before.
Right.
I run into people from here all over. I really think that the modern day city structure, city environment is part of the reason that people get to where they don't think they want to come together.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing too. We're too distracted as people. We're just too distracted with stuff, and we're very inward versus outward, like in years past. We want to be left alone. We want to be alone, and I can understand that in some respect, but not with church family, because we should want to be with church family. And I'm sure all of us have been this way before, that we're having a bad day or you have a bad morning, and the second you walk into those doors in the back and you're greeted with brethren, every bit of that is washed away and you're in a good mood. And so God knew what He was doing when He designed the assemblies. He knew that, and it's important. It's good for us. They struggled with it. Sometimes people struggle with it today, but it should always be that we're here because of what Jesus did. It should always be that way, and that's what He's encouraging them to do. All right, so we'll finish out chapter 10 real quick next week, and then we're going to get into chapter 11, which deals with the great hall of faith, by faith, and then look at all the things that were accomplished by faith. We're going to talk about that next week. Thanks, guys. Appreciate your good input today.